He sits on the edge of the playground, not because he is lonely, but because something else is happening inside him. The swings blur in the background like slow-moving planets. Voices rise and fall. The world is loud and busy, and he is listening, not in order to reply, but to understand. There is a whole life existing behind his quiet. It is an interior life rich with observation, small rituals, private experiments, and long, solemn questions that no one has asked him. People confuse quiet with absence. They measure presence by volume, by the speed of replies, by how fast someone can perform on demand. But the quiet child is not empty. They are deep. They are a reservoir. From the outside, silence looks like distance. From the inside, it is careful cultivation. And that difference between how it looks and how it feels is the beginning of everything we misunderstand about being quiet. Why does a child choose silence? Sometimes it is temperament. Some children are born with nervous systems that prefer low stimulation. They find stillness restful. Other times, silence grows as a defense. In households where speaking up brought criticism, where emotion was inconvenient, a young mind learned to self-soothe by withdrawing. In classrooms that reward speed and participation, quietness is treated like a defect rather than a gift. Yet neither temperament nor survival strategy tells the whole story. The quiet child often contains a paradox, intensely social in their way, but cautious in the ways the rest of the world demands social engagement. The quiet child sees patterns. While others rush to be heard, they notice who is left out, the micro moments of hurt, the way a teacher's smile changes when someone misses a question. Listening is their craft. They collect impressions like stones. Later, those stones become metaphors, sentences, inventions, music, the untouched material of creativity. Think of the poets and the scientists who began as watchers rather than talkers. In silence, they learned to accumulate nuance. In silence, they tested the textures of the world before making a move. And yet, silence is fragile. It lives in a social economy that prizes performance and immediacy. The quiet child frequently internalizes a single corrosive message. You must be louder to be loved. So they adapt. Some mask, learning to mimic the extroverted scripts they see on stage or in life. Masking is energy draining. It makes the inside grow colder. Others react by withdrawing further, convinced that the world will never slow down enough to meet them. What begins as a strategy for safety becomes a lifelong negotiation between self and expectation. There is also a moral subtlety here. Quiet children are often assumed to be well-behaved, obedient, easy. Adults relax, but easy is not the same as nurtured. A child who does not demand attention may not be getting it. In schools and families, attention is sometimes allocated not by need, but by volume. The child who shouts their need gets it first. The child who whispers waits. Those long waits accumulate. They are small debits on the heart's ledger that over time compound into a certain entitlement of silence, expecting less, asking less, believing that one's needs are optional. This is where the psychology curls inward. Quietness can be a chapel and a prison. The chapel is where reflection breeds insight. The prison is where self-erasure becomes habit. The quiet child learns to interpret their own voice as risky. They rehearse the sentences they wish they could say and then decide not to say them. They become fluent in apology as a form of preemptive protection. Sorry, I don't mean to bother, before they've even spoken. Over time, the apology becomes an identity, a way to survive under the assumption that their presence is an imposition. And yet, there is a power in that apology. Quiet people, when they finally speak, tend to be heard. Their words are like dated coins. They spend carefully, and because they are rare, they are noticed. But being noticed does not automatically translate to being understood. The quiet person's language is often indirect, symbolic, or slow. Modern conversation favors the immediate retort, the zippy comment. When someone offers a slow, considered thought, the group may fail to catch the thread. The quiet child then learns to compress themselves, to make their words smaller, to fit into the group's tempo. What might help us rethink this dynamic is to consider silence not as a problem to be fixed, but a quality to be respected. Silence is a different mode of engagement. It is not passive. It is patient. It holds back the rush of judgment. It allows complexity to breathe. Imagine a world in which we value the slow responder as much as the quick one. Imagine meetings where the first 10 seconds were intentionally left unfilled to give the quiet mind time to articulate something original. Most of our social architectures, classrooms, open-plan offices, team meetings, are designed for immediacy, not depth. The quiet child is often living in a world constructed against their most natural rhythm. There is another dimension we must address: the pain of misfiring. The quiet child who internalizes messages becomes as hard on themselves as the world is silent toward them. They measure their value against the noise around them and find themselves wanting. They may assume that their introspection is a defect, that their long silences are a symptom of brokenness. In adolescence, as peers form identity around visibility, social media profiles, likes, shout-outs, the quiet teen can feel increasingly out of step. The interiority that once felt rich now appears like a liability. The covert self begins to seek permission to be seen, an unspoken, aching request that says, "You may look, but do you know what to see?" Sometimes the quiet child becomes an adult who exploits their own invisibility. They work in the background, take on supporting roles, and keep their ambitions small, not because they lack capability, but because they were never taught to take up space. And yet, in other cases, the quiet child's interior life becomes fuel for leadership of a different kind. There is a leadership born of observation, a leader who listens first, who models patience, who sees the shy person in the room and makes space for them. The quiet person's capacity to hold complexity can become a profound resource in any community that learns to appreciate it. How then do we care for the quiet child? The first step is to validate without demanding performance, to welcome the child's slow replies instead of filling the silence on their behalf, to ask open-ended questions that allow them to explore rather than interrogate, to give them roles that require contemplation rather than spectacle, the recorder of ideas, the curator of projects, the observer who draws maps of group dynamics. These roles do not corner them into being less social. They honor their modality and give them pathways to contribute meaningfully. We also need to teach the quiet child skills for translation, how to turn their rich inner life into accessible expressions when needed. This is not about forcing extroversion. It is about giving tools, small rehearsals before social events, templates for starting conversations, signals they can use when they need time to formulate a response. Imagine teaching a child to say, "I'm processing, give me 5 minutes," as a normal part of social interaction. That 5-minute rule would transform how we regard the rhythm of thought and speech. There is a philosophical lesson here too. In an era that confuses speed for wisdom, quietness is a corrective. It reminds us that thought is not speech, and listening is not silence. The quiet child is an invitation to slow down, to consider, to notice. Their presence asks a deeper question. What does it mean to be fully present without dominating? How do we design societies that reward depth rather than spectacle? Yet none of this eliminates the real vulnerabilities. The quiet child is more likely to be overlooked in evaluations, to be bypassed for leadership roles, to be misdiagnosed as disengaged. The stakes are high. Without conscious intervention, the quiet child can adopt a narrative of invisibility, a belief that their voice is not necessary, and that belief, once in place, can shape a life. At the edge of this conversation is a kind of quiet revolution waiting to happen. What if we reimagined classrooms, workplaces, and families so that the quiet voice had both protection and projection? What if the slow thinker was given the first chance to speak precisely because they need it most? What would happen if our cultural default were to assume depth instead of drama? These are not theoretical questions. They are practical ones, and the answers shape destinies. The child under the maple tree, the one who watches the swings and listens for the slow drum of meaning, can be guided into adulthood that recognizes their gift rather than punishes it. They can be taught to translate, to assert gently, to find companions who prefer conversation that unfolds, and to inhabit space without shouting. There is a paradox that returns like a tide. The quieter you are, the more room you make for others to be loud. But the louder the world becomes, the more essential the quiet becomes. So the question is not how to make the quiet louder, it is how to make the world listen. And that has everything to do with rethinking value, attention, and the very architecture of our shared spaces. If you find yourself in this quiet, know this: your silence is not a deficit. It is a malleable strength. It can be armor, prison, or sanctuary, depending on how you treat it. The path forward is not to erase the quiet, but to learn how to steward it, to let it be both refuge and instrument, both safe harbor and loudspeaker when necessary. There is a way for the quiet to teach the loud how to listen, and for the loud to teach the quiet how to be seen. The bridge between these modes is practice, patience, and the willingness to reshape the expectations we inherit. Stay with that thought for a moment. There is more to uncover: how quietness shapes not just a personality, but an entire way of being. How silence, when understood, can become a language of its own, one that speaks through presence, through observation, through the subtle gravity of calm. How the quiet translates into different adult archetypes: the gentle healer who listens deeply, the analytical thinker who sees systems where others see chaos, the empathetic leader who leads not by shouting, but by creating safety in the room. Silence isn't absence, it's a different kind of expression, slower, more deliberate, more rooted in truth. And yet, in a world that rewards volume over value, that kind of expression often goes unnoticed. Because there's a hidden struggle in being the quiet one. It's not just about being soft-spoken, it's about being misread over and over again. The quiet person lives in a constant state of underestimation. Teachers overlook them for leadership roles because they don't equate calm with confidence. Friends forget to invite them to plans because they assume they wouldn't want to come. Colleagues misinterpret their reflection as hesitation, their restraint as lack of passion. In group conversations, they often speak last, or not at all, not because they don't have ideas, but because they're still listening, still processing, still choosing the right words. And yet, when someone else finally says what they were thinking, just louder, less carefully, suddenly it's brilliant. Suddenly it's worth applause. And the quiet one learns, again, that wisdom unspoken often goes unseen. This repeated invisibility creates a kind of fatigue, a quiet ache that lives behind the eyes. You start to question whether it's even worth trying to be heard. You rehearse words in your mind, but let them die on your tongue. You watch as louder, bolder voices fill the space you were too careful to claim. And part of you wonders if the world will ever be gentle enough for your kind of strength. Because make no mistake, it is a strength to pause before speaking, to listen before reacting, to think before deciding. These are not signs of weakness, they are evidence of depth. The quiet person often sees the full picture while others are still fighting over fragments. They can hold multiple truths at once. They can create peace where there is tension, simply through presence. But that strength only flourishes when it's honored. When the quiet person learns not to suppress themselves in order to fit in. Many of them spend years trying to imitate extroversion, thinking that louder means better. They force themselves into noise, into social armor that doesn't fit, and wonder why it feels exhausting. The truth is, thriving as a quiet person isn't about becoming someone else. It's about building a life that honors your rhythm. That means creating rituals of solitude, moments where silence isn't isolation, but renewal. Waking early, before the world stirs, to think, write, breathe. Keeping a notebook to translate thoughts that feel too heavy for conversation. Practicing saying small truths out loud until your voice feels like home again. Surrounding yourself with people who listen, not just hear. It's also about reclaiming power in subtle ways. When you walk into a room, you don't need to be the loudest to command attention. You just need to be present. When you speak, your words carry weight because they are rare. When you lead, your calm becomes contagious. Over time, the world begins to notice. People start turning to the quiet one for perspective, for clarity, for grounding. They realize that silence is not emptiness, it's awareness. That calm is not compliance, it's control. That gentleness is not fragility, it's precision. And maybe that's the quiet person's greatest gift, to remind the world that strength doesn't always shout, that presence doesn't always announce itself, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen deeply, think clearly, and speak only when it matters. It's a strange kind of invisibility, one that can make you feel like you're both present and absent at the same time. You exist in the same rooms, breathe the same air, hear the same conversations, yet you always feel a few steps removed, like you're watching life unfold through glass. And yet, in that invisibility, there is freedom. The quiet kid can move through life without the constant performance others feel trapped in. They can observe without being observed. They can learn without the pressure to constantly prove themselves. There's a calm kind of power in that. While others rush to speak, to be seen, to fill every silence with noise, the quiet kid listens. They catch the tone behind the words, the meaning behind the pauses. They notice the flicker of someone's expression, the way a hand trembles before a lie, the fatigue hidden in a smile. They become fluent in subtleties most people miss. And this is why so many quiet kids develop rich, intricate inner worlds. They live in layers, the visible and the invisible. On the outside, they may seem still, but inside, entire universes are unfolding. Thoughts intertwine like constellations. Emotions run deep, complex, and unspoken. Their solitude becomes a kind of sanctuary, a place where ideas can grow without interruption, where dreams can breathe without judgment. But here's the paradox. The same silence that protects them can also imprison them. What began as safety can turn into isolation. The longer you go unheard, the harder it becomes to speak. You start to believe that maybe no one would listen anyway. You start to confuse solitude with loneliness. And when you finally do try to reach out, your voice feels foreign, too soft, too small, too late. People misread that silence all the time. They see a calm face and assume indifference. They mistake shyness for arrogance, boundaries for rejection, introspection for apathy. They don't realize that behind the stillness is a storm of thought and feeling, quietly contained. Each word that isn't said is often one that's been rewritten 100 times in your mind. Each silence carefully chosen because it feels safer than misunderstanding. And that misreading, that invisible distance, can cut deep. You want to connect, but you don't know how to bridge the gap between your inner world and the noise outside. You long to be understood without having to perform understanding. You want someone to notice the small, quiet ways you care, the way you listen, the way you remember, the way you see. Sometimes you wonder if anyone ever truly sees you at all. You start to fade into the background of conversations, classrooms, relationships, until even you begin to forget how much depth you carry. You become the observer, the listener, the one who holds space for others, but rarely finds anyone who can hold space for you. And yet, even in that ache, there's a strange beauty, because the quiet kid carries something the world desperately needs, a kind of attention that isn't performative, a kind of empathy that isn't loud, a kind of intelligence that isn't rushed. While everyone else is chasing validation, the quiet kid is learning truth. They see the patterns others miss. They recognize beauty in stillness, honesty in hesitation, courage in restraint. The world may overlook them at first, but give it time. The quiet ones always find their way. They become the writers who give voice to what others feel but cannot say, the artists who paint silence into color, the thinkers who notice what others ignore, the inventors who change everything not through noise, but through clarity. Because beneath that quiet exterior lies something vast, not emptiness, but potential. The quiet kid doesn't speak less because they have nothing to say. They speak less because they're still listening, still learning, still preparing to say something that matters. And over time, that silence can start to feel like safety, like a shield against rejection, misunderstanding, or conflict. But it's a fragile kind of safety, because while it keeps out judgment, it also keeps out connection. The world begins to move around you instead of with you. People mistake your quiet for indifference, when in truth you're feeling everything, just too deeply to put into words. You start to notice how loudness is often mistaken for confidence, and how subtlety is often mistaken for weakness. You see how those who shout the most are heard first, even if they have the least to say. And somewhere inside, a small question begins to whisper, What if being quiet doesn't mean being invisible? What if there's another kind of strength, one that doesn't need to dominate the room to change it? Because the quiet kid isn't empty, they're overflowing, with ideas that never get voiced, with emotions that have no safe outlet, with dreams that live behind hesitant smiles and unspoken thoughts. And the moment they find a space where listening is valued as much as speaking, something extraordinary happens. The silence begins to turn into language. The quiet kid starts to write, to draw, to compose, to find mediums that don't interrupt them. And slowly, they learn that expression doesn't always need to be loud to be powerful. The world begins to hear them not through their volume, but through their depth. Still, healing that kind of silence takes courage. It means learning to speak even when your voice trembles. It means risking misunderstanding after years of protecting yourself from it. It means realizing that your thoughts have weight, that your presence has value, even when no one else validates it. And in that awakening, the quiet kid transforms. They don't abandon their stillness, they redefine it. Their silence becomes intentional, not fearful. Their solitude becomes sacred, not lonely. They learn to speak with purpose, to create with authenticity, and to live without apologizing for their softness. Because maybe the truth is this: the quiet kid was never behind. They were just building a world inside them. One careful thought, one observed detail, one unspoken feeling at a time. And when they finally choose to share it, the world doesn't just listen, it changes.